Okay, let's get started.
Hey, hello. Welcome. Thanks everyone for tuning in live and maybe watching the recording. This is our session today for Get Kubernetes Here Comes Knative. I'm Michael Gasch, staff engineer at Vmware and Office of the CTO, and I'm honored and pleasured to have William with me. Hey, William.
Thank you for joining. My name is William Lam. I'm a senior staff working within our cloud services business units focused on VMware Cloud.
Perfect. Thanks, man. So I'll kick it off here. So yeah, granted, this is a little bit of a clickbait title for Get Kubernetes Here Comes Knative. And we don't want to be dismissive to Kubernetes or any of the communities here. In fact, we actually use Kubernetes a lot here on the stuff that we talk about, but you will find it a little bit more being hidden behind the scenes because we're going to focus on Knative, which is a platform running on top of Kubernetes, which we believe is going to really having a huge impact on the industry going forward. So we have a short agenda. It's going to be a lot of demos, but we'll start with a little bit introduction on Kubernetes and the transition to Knative. So to give you a little bit of background, again, not a Kubernetes session, so we assume a little bit knowledge on Kubernetes because the focus will be on Knative. So from Kubernetes to Knative, rise of the platforms. So if you have heard of Kubernetes or know a little bit, you might know that it's kind of really becoming the common infrastructure API across any public and private clouds, whether you want to deploy containers or virtual machines or kind of anything, any object that you can think of, because Kubernetes is pretty extensible there. And so that is pretty, that's just great that we have this common API. And then Kubernetes also has this capability or characteristics of being self-healing. Meaning you might have seen that when you deploy an application there and something crashes, Kubernetes will try to reconcile and keep your application or the system up and running based on these kinds of control loops that you might have seen and heard from other presentations, which is pretty great, right? To then have to watch and sit there and babysit your applications. And last but not least is extensibility. Kubernetes initially was set to be a container orchestrator. But to be honest with you, lately we've seen actually Kubernetes becoming less of a container orchestrator, but more of an API to create and run any type of application or even API that you can think of, because the Kubernetes API itself is pretty flexible and unique in its terms. And so we've seen, and you might have witnessed this transition from managing servers and running applications on single server hardware towards running your applications on a data center, where basically the data center becomes your computer. You're programming against a huge data center, be it the cloud or private data center, doesn't really matter there. And so Kubernetes can be considered like this kernel, this distributed systems kernel, where we run any kind of application and program against, which is awesome. But once you start working with Kubernetes a little bit, you might feel, especially when you deal with all the YAML that we should see in a bit, it might sound a little bit too low level. It almost feel like you were writing kernel logic stuff to deploy there with all these manifests and objects and deployments and so on, which then unnecessarily leads to complexity that you have to deal with in order to create and run your applications, but also secure them and make sure that they are resilient, etc. But by the end of the day, the question is, what is the task or the job that you need to perform? And if you're not actually a Kubernetes developer or engineer, likely you will just want to run your application or deploy a task to automate something. And so time to value is really critical for you. You don't really want to learn Kubernetes and all its details. You just want to get your job done. And to be honest with you, Kubernetes might get in your way. So what I kind of omitted from the previous slide that you saw is that, in fact, there's something that your application on a server hardware runs on or uses internally, which is usually a library, libc on Linux, for example, because your application doesn't really directly talk to the kernel, or you don't write your code that directly uses kernel primitives. In fact, you might even run a higher level framework or runtime like Java or Python, where you use all these abstract utilities in the runtime without having to worry about the lower level details of doing syscalls in the kernel. And then the question is, what is this layer? Because we think that there's a missing layer in Kubernetes that would allow you the same, that you don't really have to worry about fiddling with all these Kubernetes like terms and objects like deployments and services and lower-level details, wouldn't it be nice to have something like libc for Kubernetes or for your application? And I think if you look back at some of the history of Kubernetes, especially after we kind of Kubernetes won the container orchestration wars in 2016, you've seen a lot of platforms being built on top of Kubernetes to trying to address this gap to make Kubernetes more user-friendly and usable. And so we think that Knative actually can or is going to be this layer, this kind of glue between your application and Kubernetes, making it easier to deploy and run and manage your applications in an easy way. Okay, so what is Knative? A lot of praise for this technology. Tell me what it's about. So Knative project itself describes as the goal of the Knative project is to provide a more approachable abstraction for developers on top of Kubernetes. And when I first saw this, I was like, okay, it's for developers. And I looked into it, I started playing with it. And then I realized a lot of people are shying away or might not consider themselves to find Knative usable for them because they don't consider themselves as the developers. And when I say they, I'm speaking about administrators, operators, maybe SREs. Like if you don't really have a strong developer background, you might look at Knative as something, this is for developers only. And yeah, I might need to set it up and run it for them, but there might nothing really be in for me. But we think that Knative actually is for everyone. When I say everyone, literally means administrators and operators, this kind of non-developer persona, because once you broke the essence of Knative and how to deploy your workloads or tasks on it, it's actually pretty simple. So Knative has two building blocks. One is eventing, one is serving. You can use them like in isolation, so you don't have to use serving if you just want to do eventing and vice versa. But together, obviously, they are a great fit. Let's start with eventing first. So eventing is used or gives you all the primitives to build event-driven integrations or application logic and automation. It's kind of this if this, then that. Like if something happens, when an event comes in, you want to fire off like a task or a job or a function to perform like your logic that you want to solve. As part of the eventing, Knative early on decided to use cloud events as the standardized event schema or description for how these events should look like on the outside, which has a benefit because it makes it easier to use these events and share them across clouds or basically consume and produce them across clouds, be it Azure or Google or your on-premises environment, because the events have the same shape from the outside. Then eventing gives you primitives like sources, progress, triggers, and flows to model these event pipelines or semantics that you want to have. A source is something that just emits events. Think of vCenter as one of the event sources that we have in Knative. A broker then is something that routes events from the source to a destination. Triggers is a way to define what kind of events you're interested in. So it's kind of this, hey, I'm just interested in, let's say, when a GitHub pull request was created or a virtual machine was powered on. And then you've got some advanced techniques like flows, which we'll show at the end of the session, which you can use to model like workflows and more complex event topologies. And then last but not least, the eventing infrastructure in Knative is pretty extensible because it uses some like fancy duck typing and other stuff that you can look up on the internet what it means. But basically it means that you can easily hook in your own source, your own trigger and broker into Knative eventing because it's built with this extensibility in mind. Okay, so we get eventing. So it's this nice event-driven automation, which William will show you more in detail. But the next question is, okay, so here, like I have some logic. How do I run it on Knative? And so the answer there is serving. Serving provides you all the building blocks to deploy your logic on top of Knative. And it wants to give you the serverless experience for, say, HTTP workloads. So if you have an application or a script that can spin up an HTTP server where it listens for incoming requests, then you already have all the pieces needed to run your application on Knative. In fact, most of the container images out there can like easily run on Knative. And Knative doesn't really want to get into your way. It basically wants to abstract and hide all the complex machinery and internals for you so you can actually get your job done. For example, setting up DNS and TLS encryption and handling for your application workloads. One of the nice properties of Knative, which you might also know from public cloud function as service environments like Lambda, AWS Lambda, or Azure Functions, is scale to zero. So whenever your application or your function is not in use, Knative will basically scale it down to 0 if you want to, and it won't consume any infrastructure. And when a new request comes in, Knative will hold that request, bring up your workload, and then it will serve it. We also do traffic management. So if you want to do versioning between like your current version of your application and you have a new one, and you want to do some canary rollout, some advanced patterns there, that is also there in Knative. And it works obviously nicely and out of the box with eventing. So what I'm trying to say here is that any application logic that you have, and be it the script or a more complex microservice topology, if it can handle HTTP requests and can respond to HTTP requests, for example, it easily runs on Knative using serving. Okay, let me give you a quick demo. The first one here is basically showing the YAML that you would have to provide in order to set up a Kubernetes application using the Kubernetes primitives versus what that looks like on Knative. So I have a quick markdown file here. I hope everyone can see it. It's basically your task here is to deploy the canonical Kubernetes web application, which uses autoscaling with the minimum number of lines of YAML. So the goal is to like run this thing with the minimum lines of YAML, as I said. So here we have a deployment, and the details don't really matter. It's basically what I took from the Kubernetes web page. It's spinning up a deployment, running the PHP application. Obviously, we want to expose this to the cluster and the outside world, so we create a service here. We also need autoscaling, right? That is a requirement for our tasks. So we define some autoscaling rules here. And for the sake of this exercise, I'm not including any further YAML for ingress and custom metrics and DNS and all the stuff. So even those 3 files here for autoscaling services and deployments, that is already 50 lines of YAML. And I'm not really following any of the best practices for like how to secure and harden and basically deploy this application on top of Kubernetes. Now, let me show you the Knative way. So in Knative, we obviously have the same object types here, the fields that you need to provide, like API version, kind, and metadata. And then the only thing that you really have to provide is the container image. All the other stuff, like exposing this and doing autoscaling and so on, this is automatically handled for you by Knative. Here, there's a little bit of a like non-standard because this container uses actually port 80. If it would have used port 8080, which is a non-privileged port, which is actually a best practice to use, then I wouldn't even have to specify the port here because Knative can infer this as a default. But because this container is running on port 80, I have to include this. So we went down from like 50 lines of YAML, a little bit cheating because we don't do ingress and traffic management, down to say like 10 lines of YAML. And there's, by the way, even a command line utility so that you don't have to deal with any YAML. You can do it more in like an imperative way. So let me deploy this on my Knative environment. So I have here on the right, you just see my Kubernetes. It's a local Kubernetes environment. I have Knative installed, nothing fancy to see there. And the application is already running for the deployment manifest that I showed you earlier on Kubernetes. So let me deploy this YAML file for Knative that I just showed you into the cluster. So what you will see here on the right is Knative spins up a service, this guy here. It is ready through, and I'm sorry for the wrapping because I'm zooming in here a little bit so you can see all the details, but that wraps the text. And then it also has spun up a pod for our deployment. So under the covers, Knative does all this for you. It creates deployments and pods and replica set, but you don't really have to do that. And then when I call this, because it's accessible from the outside, it's an ingress, I'm getting back my response. So if we wait a little bit, what you will actually see is that this pod goes away because by default, and because I haven't said any otherwise, Knative will do scale to 0 for me. And I want to actually show that to you. What does it mean? Well, because there's a deployment in play here. Sorry, Zero, it's not for you. Because Knative uses deployment under the covers, it will actually scale down that deployment to 0 and then kill the pod, or basically terminate the pod, which we'll see in a bit here. And once that has happened, what happens if a new request comes in? And we'll do that in a second once the pod terminates. I think by default it's like 60 seconds for Knative serving to wait to terminate your workload. And this is highly configurable. Like if you don't want this, you can set like a minimal number of instances and a maximum. You can also tune the behavior of how many requests your pod should be handling, etc., etc. So let's give this a second. We're still doing good in time. William, any questions so far? Are we good on the comment in the chat?
Yeah, we're pretty good in all that. What's one of the benefits of scale to 0? Is there like a resource consumption mechanism that's beneficial?
Exactly. This is kind of something that AWS kind of led with the initial announcement when they did Lambda and later other serverless services, which is why would you want to pay for resources? Because imagine this is not your own infrastructure, you're running this on EC2 instances, for example. Why do you want to pay for these resources if they are idling around, right? And so scale to zero is basically terminating all these instances if they don't have anything or not a lot of work to do, is a means to reduce the cost on one hand, but also infrastructure footprint, even though you might not be billing per cost, but energy-wise or data center footprint-wise, right? So here we see that this pod is being terminated, and it takes a while because Knative also makes sure that incoming, like current requests, which are in flight, are actually being served, etc. So it's a little bit cautious here, but the pod is going to be going away. You can already see that here in the deployment for that Knative service, it has actually 0 pods ready, right? And so let's call curl again, and you will see this kind of cold start latency that we also know from, for example, Lambda, where Knative will hold that request, bring up that pod. It's kind of there right now, right? It brought back a new pod, and then it will be served. So you don't lose requests or they are not dropped on the floor. All right, back to the presentation that was demo 1. And I think, yeah, now it's William's turn, and I'm already excited about that. So let me stop sharing.
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen.
Right.
Let me know if you're able to see my screen, Michael.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Now? Not yet. Let's see. There, that should be good now.
Yeah, incoming.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Alrighty, let's jump into some Viva. Okay, so Michael gave a great introduction, and this is really a quick introduction into Knative, but what does that really mean in the broader context in the VMware infrastructure, right? It kind of led to this little project that Michael and I actually started back in 2019 was when this project was released as an open source project and released as a VMware Fling, but we've been looking into this even a couple of years even before that. So I want to introduce you to something called Viva, the VMware Event Broker appliance or application, and there's actually a couple of deployment form factors, right? And so obviously a virtual appliance is a very easy way for many of our customers to deploy the solutions, but for customers who do have existing Kubernetes infrastructure, including running with Vsphere with Tanzu or Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, you can also deploy all the different components of Viva that makes up Viva today as a native Kubernetes application. And one of the things that we want to take a look at is sort of, can we look at, a common scenario where customers are, doing something really interesting with vCenter events, right? If you look at today, vCenter out of the box in the latest version of Update 2 has around 1,800 plus events that it emits today, right? This is over 2 decades worth of innovations and functionality that's provided. And this is just out of the box. This does not include any of the second party, third party solutions that you might have deployed, like VROps, Update Manager, maybe some third-party backup and monitoring solution. And so as you add more and more solutions, vCenter has always been extendable and from that standpoint, and additional events can be added. And so every customer's environment is actually truly unique to a certain degree. And this concept of being able to take these events, which are really state changes, right? And so vCenter today emits something called an event, right? These are basically state changes in the system. An example of this could be a virtual machine gets powered off, a host gets disconnected, and they also emit things like an alarm, right? These are basically threshold-based notifications. So something like CPU going to a certain amount of megahertz or memory, or as well as data store utilization going above a certain percentage being consumed. And these things can derive some actions in vCenter. And so I do feel that, very early on, the original architects of vCenter kind of foresaw this event-driven automation construct in the very, very early days in the very first incarnation of vCenter. And this is still true to today in the latest version of our software stack, right? We support the ability to execute a number of different actions. They're not the most modern to date, but they're fairly usable. The first one is being able to send an email. There are some limitations today to be able to send email, but you can do the really most basic. The next one is around sending an SNMP trap. This is great for monitoring, but probably not a great mechanism to derive automation workflow use cases, but it's certainly there. And then the last one is to be able to run and execute a command. This might sound great, but in reality, what you're really doing is you're running code on the vCenter server appliances. This breaks so many different best practices. I can't even list them all out, but another downside to that is you're not only taking resources away from your vCenter server, which is really designed to manage your cloud infrastructure, but if you have a rogue script, right, it could potentially take down vCenter, and there's not really a lot of functionality there because you're just running code directly on a basic terminal, right? And so when you look at this holistically, it's not very extendable when you think about the year that we're in today and all the different scenarios that you might want to do with these particular vCenter events. Let me cover some of the particular use cases that we normally talk about when we talk about Viva itself. First and foremost, notification is certainly the most popular and common scenario, right? When something happens in your infrastructure, you want to get notified. It could be Slack, it could be Microsoft Teams, it can be PagerDuty, it can even be a simple SMS text message, right? Super, super powerful, and something that we still find a lot of customers are implementing and using on a day-to-day basis. And when you look at how this occurs in the vSphere environment, it becomes very difficult. Next, we look at things like automation integration use cases, right? Some event happens. I want to now affect change back in my infrastructure. This could be my vSphere environment. Good example is if VM gets powered on, I want to apply a number of vSphere tags, based on the guest operating system, maybe my CMDB database and the different applications that are applied. And I want to affect the vSphere environment. I may also want to talk to maybe third party or even internal services you've developed. Maybe it's an internal CMDB, a ticketing system, maybe an IPAM to be able to request IP addresses. This also goes into integrating into both private cloud services as well as public cloud. We have a number of customers deploying such a solution in VMware Cloud and AWS, and they're integrating with something like CloudWatch, where I want to take selective events from vCenter, right? Aggregate that up into something like a CloudWatch service, because there I have both my application logs, my infrastructure logs. I want to be able to see that in one go. And so being able to easily, send these particular events out to those different sources and do interesting use cases is still not a very easy thing to do today, even in 2021. The next piece of it is around remediation, right? An event happens, a host gets disconnected. The canonical scenario that we normally see is, a host goes down, hardware fails, VMs will automatically get restarted, with vSphere HA, but somebody still needs to go and take a look at those VMs to make sure, A, the VMs came back online properly, to make sure that the applications themselves are operationally. And normally what this means is somebody is waking up in the middle of the night, taking a look at which host was affected, make a note of all the different VMs that had been restarted, go to the CMDB system, and actually start to send out notifications to application owners. I'm sure many of you can probably agree that that's something you've had to do at one point in your life. I know I can say that from personal experience. That was one of my first job out of college, and it was a pain in the butt to do. And when you look at something like being able to talk to our vSphere APIs, grok how the API works, write the code you need to then pull out all this information, and then actually write the piece of code that is actually the most valuable, right? It's what we call the business logic. It's to go and notify somebody, say, hey, this VM was restarted. Go please and verify your application. When we think about that end-to-end workflow and be able to build that out today, it's really challenging. It's not a simple thing to do. And then lastly, the last two around audit and analytics, this really is some really powerful use cases that have, rarely been fully exercised to its full extent, right? The ability to selectively pick events like, failed logins, for example, which contains even the source IP address. And so you can take a look to see if your infrastructure is being attacked from a vSphere standpoint, to be able to look at all the different provisioning workflows and the different operations that are happening. Imagine I can take these events and send them to my security team, send them to my analytics team. And today, when you look at it, we normally have to expose these end user groups who don't need access to vCenter server, right? But the way that it's exposed today, they really need access to the raw data to be able to do anything interesting. And so from an event-driven standpoint, wouldn't it be awesome to be able to take these events, send them to multiple consumers where they never need to know about the vSphere APIs, they don't even need access to vCenter, and they can actually deliver really high value returns depending on your particular set of scenarios, right? So see, these are some of the use cases that we've been seeing across the board from a Viva standpoint. And so what does this matter, right? Ultimately, what we want to enable, kind of what Michael alluded to earlier, is be able to say for a given set of events, and in this case, we're really talking about vCenter, but in the future, it could be many other sorts of events other than just vCenter, where if this event occurs, I want to be able to do something with that, right? If then this, that is a really simple consumer grade service that allows you to be able to set these basic things, right? If it's 6 a.m. in the morning, automatically send me an update on the latest news of the day. And we want to be able to do that with vCenter. And we want to be able to do that with vCenter in a way that does not require modifying the vCenter server code, and really being able to teach a brand new set of actions that just was never really possible, and really give the flexibility and imagination to our end users and customers, right? And that's really the vision behind what we're driving with the Viva project. And ultimately, what this all boils down to, right, if you didn't grok kind of the individual details, is that the possibility really are endless, right? We talked about Slack. If a VM gets powered off, I can then selectively pick out the different properties of that particular event, post it to a Slack channel. Here, I might even include a URL directly to the vCenter server. So as an end user of that consumption of that event, I can click on it. I can be taken directly back into the vCenter environment and say, hey, why is this VM powered off? I can actually power it back on. Maybe you want to do something a little bit more modern, maybe more mobile, right? Where I want to get this exact same notification, but I want to receive a text message, right? Imagine if vCenter was able to send you a text message. Really basic example. And again, I can include a URL there, and I can actually optimize the output here. In this case, I've got a mobile device. There's not a whole lot of screen real estate, so I don't need all these other details. Maybe I just want to know who powered off the VM and give me a direct URL. Maybe we want to go old school. Never played with a pager before, but we did a demo a couple years back where you can actually send a notification. This is actually from a VMware Cloud and AWS infrastructure, and it's sending to a physical pager device, right? And again, this is a really basic notification example, but you can imagine some of the integration, some of the third party, some of the auditing scenarios being quite powerful. From a persona standpoint, first and foremost, we really want to focus and enable our VI and cloud admins. We really do believe that, this event-driven infrastructure automation concept is not net new. Many of you have been doing it for decades on end. I know I certainly have been doing this for quite some time, but we think that we can take, these modern techniques and really modernizing this aspect of it and really giving a much better user experience to our customers. And part of that is really the Knative experience, right? Second, we talked a lot about remediation. So SRE operations, automatically being able to file support tickets so that you're not being woke up in the middle of the night, right? You can start to come up with all sorts of interesting policies and have these things all be event driven. Automation engineering teams, right? You might have teams that are building out VRA blueprints, VRA workflows that are really focused on building all this business logic. And then you have different teams who might be SRE, who might be VRA cloud admins. They will then be consumers of this automation that's built, right? And so having a targeted team to allow them to have a platform to start to build all these interesting pieces of functionality is quite useful as another target audience. And then lastly, there's a huge opportunity for a VMware second and third party ecosystem. You think about things like monitoring, backup solution. Just imagine, as one of these vendors, you can say for a event like a VM gets created event, I can automatically apply policies like backup and monitoring automatically, right? Maybe security hardening, just based on these things. Maybe if a VM gets deleted, I'll automatically go and archive certain information, maybe update a CMDB. There's so much opportunity here from a third-party system, right? And so really, really inclusive of all the different folks that can consume an event-driven platform like Viva. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to dive into a quick demo and show you a little bit, give you a quick preview of what the a version of Viva that we've been working on. Let's see, where's my browser at? See my kids right there. Are you guys able to see my screen still, Michael?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, it looks good. Okay, so I've already pre-selected a version. This is an unreleased version of Viva, so we're just really kind of giving you a sneak peek at some of the work that we've been working on. I'll just kind of take you through what a deployment model looks like. Again, we can deploy Viva both in a virtual appliance model, which is what I'm walking you through, as well as a Kubernetes-based application. So here, the first step is really just in. Yeah.
Do you mind just full screening the browser or just?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, good point. Thank you. So here, what we're going to do is put in our information. So let's see, mine's a /24 network. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to just enter all the basic things. So here I'm just entering the information of what I want my Viva hosting to be, some basic information like IP address, very important things like DNS, making sure both forward and reverse works properly. Put in my NTP. So we've got all these things added in there. If you do have the ability, if you have proxy requirements, we're going to have a section there. We don't have any of that in this environment, so we'll go in and remove that or ignore it specifically. And then what we'll do is also go in and enter credentials. Let's see, may not have been. Yeah, there we go. If you want SSH enable, you can go and enable that for debugging purposes. And then this section is really when we start to configure some of the Viva aspect, right? This is basically the vCenter server that I want to configure my Viva to connect to. You only need a read-only account. So I've actually created an account. Let's see, sorry, vsphere.local. Right, so you only need to create an account. This can be Active Directory, or this could be a vSphere account that just has read-only, right? We don't need any access to your vCenter server, and this is all we need to basically start to pull out the events from the vCenter server to start to do some interesting things with this. So, perfect. And then we have this upcoming functionality where if you optionally want to include an additional account, and this account just needs to have access to the ability to do plugin registration. So here you only need a couple of privileges to be able to perform this operation. And so if you input this information here, what we'll go ahead and do is register this net new UI plugin infrastructure. And then obviously if you have TLS self-signed certificates, you can go and check that box. And then here, the next section, really simple. out of the box, we have Knative support. In our 0.5 release, we supported the ability to have an external Knative deployment. And what that means is that when you deploy Viba, we expect you to deploy this Knative infrastructure elsewhere. In an upcoming release, we're actually going to make this even more simpler, where we're going to have an embedded model. And just by having this as a default selected, which is the default behavior, it's going to go in and set up an embedded deployment. So there's no additional settings you really need here. Here, it's really used for external. So just like that, right? You enter your vSphere credentials, read-only account. If you want to have a UI functionality, go in and deploy, have a separate account that has that permission, and then just leave the default processor. And that's all you have to do. We're going to actually cancel out of this, right? It'll just take a little bit of a minute. And what we'll do is we'll actually switch back to the deck, and we'll go into a quick example of what it looks like, because I already have a version of the Viba appliance already deployed. So let me see. Okay. Michael, let me know if the everything's coming through okay and we're doing okay on time.
It's good.
Okay. All right. So let's get into like an actual demo, right? And we talked a lot about Slack, and so hey, figure that's a very simple and easy one. So let's take a look at what we're going to do with the Slack example. So after you've got your Viba appliance deployed, we're going to walk you through a process of actually deploying a function that will deliver the following functionality. Let's say I've got a VM that's powered on. I don't want this VM to ever power off. If it does, I want to get a notification with Slack. Really, really simple, right? But it does go through a pretty nice exercise of what we're going to do. So let's say the VM gets powered off. What vCenter is going to do is generate a VM powered off event. We want to be able to create a function that traps on that particular event. And my goal is to be able to run a function. In this example, I'm just using a PowerShell function. We have a native way of doing PowerShell via Knative. And I want to be able to call into a Slack API, right? So it's basically the equivalent of doing an invoke web request, or like a curl example, for example. And then Slack should be able to send us a notification, right? So that's what we're going to achieve here.
All right, let me take it over then, William, on the command line. Is that good?
Hold on. Actually, I did some updates this morning, so if you don't mind, I actually want to show everybody some of the new work that we've been doing. I think it should work.
Are we now? Are we off script?
We have some time, right? Like, yeah, we're good?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Sorry, man. I know this is supposed to be your demo. I just getting way too excited about this. Okay, so if you remember earlier in the OVF property setting, I mentioned that there's this new set of settings that will allow where you can put in some credentials. You're going to get a UI. I'm not sure if you've seen this before, Michael, but so we actually have a nice integration with the Viba appliance. And so here, what you're looking at is my Vsphere environment, and we actually now have a new VMware event broker icon. And in fact, you can even get to it from our shortcuts. Right, so I'm going to click onto this guy, and now the Viba appliance is actually serving up a native vSphere UI plugin into your vCenter server, and it does a couple of things. So let me take you a quick walkthrough, and then we'll go ahead and go through that deployment. So one of the things you'll first notice is all the events. So remember earlier I mentioned that there's over 1,800 plus events. Now today you have to kind of go to this GitHub repo that I've created and do all the searching. Just imagine being able to quickly just grok your existing vCenter server, right? So right now in this environment I have over 1862 events, right? So I can easily search through these events. So remember earlier I want to search for like a powered off. Oh, there it is. I quickly found the powered off events. I can see that, hey, this is a standard type of event. I can also get, this is considered an info. I have some detail. Really powerful being able to quickly search through all of my existing events that's applicable to my vCenter server, all in the vSphere UI, right? Really powerful and really reactive. The next section is a place where we'll be able to see the different functions that will be deployed. Obviously, I have nothing deployed, so we'll come back to this in a second. And the last part of it is, as you build these different functions, like, for example, send it to Slack, you probably have some things like sensitive information, like maybe the webhook URL, maybe you've got some passwords, maybe you got some secrets. You want to be able to also encode those and make that available to your function. The nice thing about this is that you can create these different secrets that are then reusable. So let's now go ahead and take a look at our example that we're going to demo, which is a Slack notification. So I'm going to bring up a couple of screens here. And let me know if it's still visible, Michael. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and, looks good? Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a Slack secret. This is going to basically contain my webhook. So what I'm going to do really quickly is, let me stop sharing just real quick. I want you guys to see my secret. So how do I stop? Okay, so I'm stopping share screen. And then I'm going to copy my webhook, and I'll just create add secret. And then let me just reshare. Okay. I may have to disable that webhook eventually. Okay. Okay, so now I've got my secret. Now let's go and
I share.
Oh,
it's coming back. Good.
Is it coming back? Okay, we did it. Okay, so we created that secret called Slack secret, right? We're going to reference that in a second. In the events I mentioned earlier, I've got this VM here. So what we'll do is we'll go and have a VM and we'll go and base it on the powered off event. So all I have to do here is deploy a function, right, using the UI, which I think is probably a little bit faster than your CLI method, Michael. We come into the new wizard. I'm just going to call this, let's call this Knative, PowerShell Slack, right? That's exactly what it's going to do. And here I've got this nice image that's going to do all the magic for me. If I have any environmental variables, I can actually expose these things. So here I actually have in my function, I have a variable called debug. And I'll go ahead and set that to true. If you don't have any, you can skip this area. So you can actually define custom variables that mean something in your code, right? And all you have to worry about is the business logic of just setting to Slack. You don't need to think about how to connect to vCenter. And all you saw just in the previous screen, I just found my event and I basically added to the function itself. Here, because this particular function expects a secret, right? I go in and check the box. If you don't have any secrets, you don't have to check it, but this is really useful because now you can actually have secrets be reusable in multiple places. And in just quick 4 steps and more like 3 steps, I've now got a function I've defined. This is the container image that I've created, right? So this is where you write your code. Now, I showed a PowerShell example. This can be Python, this can be Go, this can be Java. Heck, this can be a shell script, for example, right? It's really your business logic of doing something. And again, we want to be able to send a notification to Slack, which is what I've got open on my right-hand side. In this particular event, I want it to be a powered off event, right? If I want to do another one, we can easily add that. And I've got some environment variables as well as my secret. So again, let's go ahead and deploy that. And here you can see under this particular event in vCenter, we can see that there's a function mapped to here. We can also go over to the functions tab and we can see that we've got the exact same deploy here. And if I refresh, if we give it a second, we'll say we can see that it's getting deployed right now. So if we refresh, hopefully another. So now it's ready. Now, if I wanted to add more events, I can easily do that just by clicking on the add event, right? And let's say I want to look for, powered on, right? And just like that, I found my powered on DR7 event. But we'll just go and leave that as a default now. So I've got everything in my infrastructure all deployed, right? Probably less than 30 seconds, if that. So let's see, what VM should I disable? Oh, there's this good one right here. That's a good one right here. So I've got this VMware code session test VM. Let's go ahead and power that off. Let's see what happens. Crossing fingers, everything happens. Demo gods are on our side. And just like that, right? So it's fast. Usually if I have to jump screens and all that and jump, it takes me longer to actually jump the screen. But here, the event happened, right? It triggered off of our function immediately and it's generated this alarm. And in my function, all I did was basically just call a webhook, right? And I did some fancy icons, emojis, and here you can see I've extracted a couple of pieces of information that I felt was useful for this particular task that I was trying to accomplish, right? I want to be able to get a notification sent to a very particular Slack channel. I've got my VM. I've got the tame that this executed in case there's any kind of delays. I know exactly when this came from vCenter, right? And also know who did this, right? So imagine if this was Michael, I can say, hey, Michael, why'd you power off this VM? We really need this VM for demo purpose, right? But hopefully this shows you a really, really basic example and just the power of what you can do. And really, this is really showcasing a brand new piece of functionality that the team has been really working hard on, is really integrating this into a native vSphere experience, right? So that you do not have to use a CLI to deploy the functions. Okay, so let me switch back to our slide deck. How are we doing on time, Michael?
Perfect timing.
Perfect. Okay. Sorry about that, man. I didn't mean to take it away. So let me stop sharing, and then I will pass the ball back to you, sir.
Cool. Thank you, man. That was an impressive demo. I don't think I can top this with the next one. All right. So let's go full screen. Can you see my screen, William?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, perfect. So maybe just to quickly recap, because the UI kind of really hides all the magic that Knative does for us in the backend. So we have something that gets events out of vCenter, which is like a component in the Viva appliance. And then we have a Knative broker, which gets all these events in, and then it kind of distributes these events to subscribers. And one of the subscribers there was William's Slack notification function. So it was, even though it was a simple mapping of like a one event to one function, it was still impressive because you really didn't have to deal with any of these logic. Literally, you just write your function, your logic, put it in a container, deploy it, and you're good. Now, there's a slightly more advanced scenario that we also want to share with you, which is also using some of the primitives that we now have in Knative, which is complex workflows or topologies. And here's a use case that we've also seen a lot in like our VMware communities, and also in the Viva community as being requested as well, around Vsphere Alarms. So if you're not familiar with Vsphere Alarms, basically it's something that you can configure in vCenter, that you create an alarm on different objects like data stores or virtual machines. For example, here we can create an alarm that if the data store disk usage is above a certain threshold. And then, as William showed you earlier in the vCenter capabilities slide, we have the typical send email notifications, send SNMP traps, or run a script for that. And that has worked quite well for our customers. But lately, with all these new technologies and integrations and rise of event-driven platforms, we feel that it's probably a little bit too limited for new use cases. So some of the challenges that we have with Vsphere Alarms are obviously around the integrations. They are pretty limited there. Yes, you could obviously create a script and run it on the Vsphere appliance, but that puts a lot of security concerns, and you have to make sure that the script doesn't really take down the Vsphere appliance. You have to have privileges to deploy it. And it might work for you as a Vsphere admin, but imagine you have a business unit or a different team who actually don't know about Vsphere or don't actually want to know about Vsphere at all. They just want to get an event, a notification. Well, that's probably too much of a burden for them to set this up. So speaking of other security concerns is for just to configure an alarm and then deploy a script, you need VC access, you need a role, you need to create a role, which has to be audited and vetted and key rotated to be like following good security patterns. And also for the VCSA scripts, you have to like obviously patch them, update them, make sure that the runtime allows it, etc. There's other concerns around resources. For example, if you don't want to put the script on the VC appliance, but you want to poll for information from vCenter, or you have a script that periodically runs. Obviously, polling involves resources and threads and network connections on the vCenter. You again need a security account to make these calls out, and it's just really wasteful because most of the time you won't get any new information from polling. Pushing information out would actually be a better approach. And so that's why we've seen some users using Viva to use alarm events. So what you probably didn't know is that any alarm, when it fires in the UI, you will also get an event sent out to you or displayed in the Vsphere UI. Now we can tap into that event, and this was possible with Viva before, but there's a challenge with that, which is the alarms event, and William will show that in a bit, doesn't really have a lot of information. It just basically tells you that the alarm went on from like green to yellow on that particular object, but it really doesn't tell you much about the alarm itself. For example, the threshold that was configured, or who created the alarm, the description, etc. So it was a little bit too limited. That's why we didn't really talk much about alarm events in the context of Viva yet. Now with Knative being the default engine in Viva going forward in the next release, we actually have a nice way of enhancing alarm events and enriching alarm events to make it more easier for you. So here's a simple work or like event flow where vCenter emits an alarm event. It gets trapped by Viva. Viva then creates a cloud event, which is like standardized event structure out of this. And then in this case, what we want to do is we want to intercept that event before it gets to your function or your logic, and we want to inject the alarm details into that event. So for that, we create a sequence, and the sequence is like a step-based workflow where Knative under the covers will make sure that it calls basically the services or your functions listed in order. And here, the first service being called from Knative is an alarm server. An alarm server is a little bit of code. It's just like a Go binary spinning up a web server, an HTTP daemon, and it will get this event. It will check whether it's actually an alarm event. If it's an alarm event, it will go out to VC. It will request the alarm details from it. It will put the details in a cache so that for subsequent alarm events on the same alarm definition, we don't always go out to VC. So we basically proxy and shim and are a little bit more efficient and faster there. And then we enrich the event, and then we can fan it out and send it to multiple subscribers or functions thereof. And so this is where we want to call a parallel. A parallel versus a sequence is actually calling multiple functions or services in parallel, as the name suggests. So what we want to show in the demo is that we take this enriched event, and we also only want to send the enriched event down to a Slack function that Wilhelm has written, but also a UI component where you can inspect this workload. Now notice that these two blue boxes, they won't receive the original event. because that is being intercepted and transformed by the alarm server in the beginning. So your logic doesn't really have to check for, is this the original one which lacks the details, or this is the new one which has the details? Your logic literally only gets the enriched alarm event if it were sent by VC right from the beginning. Okay, so last demo. Pray for the demo gods. The stage is yours.
All right, let's take a look at this. So, are you guys able to see my screens okay? Oops.
Yep. Can see
okay. So the other thing, so on top of the Vsphere UI integration, there was this really cool service that Scott Nichols from the Knative team actually put together, and Michael introduced me. And what we've done with this is actually integrate this service, and it's called Sockeye. And I'll show you what that looks like really quickly. And this is actually out of the box, and it talks to Knative. And one of the really cool things about this service is that it will actually show you all the different processed events from Viva in a graphical format, right? So you might know the event that you're interested in, say a powered on event. But what you might not know is, well, what does that payload look like? This is the actual information coming from the Vsphere UI. And then obviously it's been rendered in a cloud event specification. And so this is a really cool little UI service that allows you to basically tap into any event stream from Knative. And it just happens that our sources for events is vCenter Server. But imagine if you had another system that was publishing cloud events, you can actually check out this open source project that Scott put together. And we thought this was quite valuable because it actually makes it really easy to actually start to do function development, right? As I know the event, I can actually have it generated inside of the UI. And then I can actually grab the payload and look at what it looks like, right? To be able to pull out information like, hey, who was it that created it, when the time was, any additional value, right? And this is real time, right? It's pretty cool because it's a little stateless application. So what we're going to do here for this particular demo is going to be filter on the particular subject called alarm status, right? So I'm going to create this filter, and now it's stop the filtering aspect of it, right? Michael, let me know if my audio is still coming through. I think my earpods are starting to drop on audio.
I'm hearing you well.
I'm okay. All right, so let's pray. So in this example, we're going to do the canonical example. Data store fills up. I mean, we always have that particular problem, and I want to get notified again using our Slack example. Very simple. So here I've got this alarm that's already been pre-created, and let's take a look at the alarm definition. Right, I've got this alarm called alarm warn. It's on a data store type. Right, this is a particular data store. And then I've got a usage right here that says if it's above 5%, right, just to make sure that this alarm actually fires off. I obviously have more than 5% of usage. And in this case, I want the alarm to generate a warning. And what this means in the UI, Vsphere UI, is it will generate a little icon here, right, a little yellow icon that you've all probably seen and potentially ignored. Now, I can always do more of an integration that's out of the box from vCenter, but we said earlier, it's really limited, right? There is no sense of Slack operation. So imagine if we can do that. So let's go and cancel all that. You can see this alarm has already been defined at this object, and it's currently disabled, right? So we have no alarm notification, and we certainly have more than 5% utilization. So let's come back to our alarm definition, and I'm going to enable it. And just by simply enable it, right, that alarm will go ahead and be live, and then it's going to notice and hopefully fire off, and we'll see what that looks like. And we'll take a look at from a Sockeye standpoint before we take a look at the output. So go and enable it. Hopefully that will kick off. And so let's see if I refresh. There we go. So the summary already taken off. And you can see that. Oh, all right. So let me get back to this, but we can see that it generated the alarm. So I guess we'll look at the output first. And that happened a lot faster than I was expecting. So we've got the alarm name, right? So that fired off. We actually look at the type of alarm. This happens to be a warning. So nothing's hard coded here. It's all dynamic based on data, right? So I've noticed that, hey, this particular alarm is actually a warning threshold. It's identified this object. I've also do some nice emojis here. So if it's a data store, if it was a VM object, I can actually visualize this differently. And then I also have the threshold value that I showed you earlier, right? Greater than 5%, and I can see the trigger date, right? So automatically, it sent that notification out there. Now, obviously, you can do other things with it. You can maybe go out to your data store administrator and say, hey, do I need to reclaim some storage? Maybe I need to provision some additional storage to help for these VM. But let's go back to Sockeye and see what happened here in this particular implementation that we had talked about. So here we can see that by creating this filter, I actually have two events that occurred. The first one at the bottom is actually the default alarm that comes from vCenter server. So if you went to vCenter and you use the APIs and queried it, this is exactly what you see, right? You would see some information about, hey, this alarm fired off. It went from gray to yellow. I have no idea what the heck gray to yellow really means, right? You might know it if you created the alarm, but if you're a consumer of it, you really don't know what that definition is, kind of like what Michael hinted at, right? And then we kind of say, okay, well, we know the alarm and we have the MOREF of the alarm. But again, there's no details here. We have some information about the thing that it triggered off of, which is this data store, which is very useful. But we don't have any information about the data store, about the alarm itself. Now, using this new Vsphere Alarm example that Michael's built, we've been able to take this event, enrich it, right? And my function doesn't see this generic event, right, which is an alarm status change. What we've done automatically behind the scenes for you is actually enrich this exact same event and added a brand new set of properties called alarm info. And this alarm info actually goes to vCenter server in a very smart and intelligent manner to grab back that alarm definition. So now I can say, hey, this Viva alarm warn is actually an expression. It's currently using an above versus a below, and I can actually see the threshold, which is 5%. So now you have all the information. And so obviously, if you have different types of alarm, different threshold mechanism, you can get that enriched information where your function never needs to ever go back to vCenter. Whereas today, if you need to do this right now, you would have to write a function to trap on this particular event, connect back into vCenter, grab all this information, and then create your alarm. And so look at all the different tasks that you need to go back to, right? So it really makes this not in an ideal manner. So if we go back to our example here, I've got this alarm, and I'm going to just reset it for a second. Now, let's say I want to show a critical alert, right? So here we've got this basic one. So let's go ahead and just create a brand new one just to make sure that we're not hard coding anything in here. So we'll create another alarm called alarm critical. We'll set at the data store level. Are you guys still able to hear me, Michael? Let me see.
Sorry. So can you hear me? Sorry for the interruption. William, Kripa, can you still hear me?
Yeah, William lost the audio, but he's back.
Audio okay now? Sorry.
Oh, he's also back. Yeah.
Is it okay?
That was crazy. Demo guts. I also lost power here.
Okay. All right. Let's try that again, folks. All right. So back in here, didn't do anything special. Okay. So I'm going to go and set it above. And now I'm just going to change it to 10%. So we're going to change it to something different value. And really the key here is now I want it to be showing as a critical, right? So what critical means is now I'm going to actually show a red icon, right? And so I'll go and click next, go and create. And hopefully in a second, we should see this change. Okay, so now we've got the alarm critical. And hopefully in a second or so, we should see, okay, so now we've got the secondary notification. And now you can see that it's rendered slightly differently. It's using a different icon to say that this is an error alarm. And we've got a threshold of 10%, right? So you can see really easily how you can actually start to customize this and again, taking advantage of this sequence and parallel concept within Knative. That was awesome. Let me go ahead and pass the ball back to Michael to close this up on the session.
All right. Thanks, William. Great demo. Let's wrap up here. Just a quick comment. You might be wondering, hey, Michael said that sockeye, the UI, will only see that alarm event, but William actually saw all the events. We set up the demo so that we can actually show you that the standard event and the enriched event, because otherwise you would literally only have seen the enriched event in sockeye in the UI. So that was not a defect, that was intentionally. All right, let's wrap up. So quickly to summarize, we believe that Knative is becoming the default runtime for web services on Kubernetes. And in fact, we probably don't have shown you a lot on like how to write services on top of Knative, which we'll do in one of the follow-up sessions here as well. But once if you understand how to create a container image and run a HTTP workload in that image, you're already good, right? That's it. There's nothing really special that you have to do. And Knative does all the magic for you under the covers. And AWS kind of reinvented it with AWS Lambda a couple of years ago, but we believe event-driven is becoming the new normal in modern systems and integration and how these kind of cloud services are being designed and developed. And last but not least, we do want to unlock Knative for the I am not a developer persona, because we believe that Knative really helps everyone out there, be it you just want to write a script, you just have a task that should be running periodically, or you're a crazy web developer and you want to do fancy stuff on Knative. And that's why we also have created some functionality in PowerShell and Cloud Events to make it easier for the VI admin or PowerShell community in general to write functions and services running on top of Knative. And we'll show that in one of the next sessions there as well. All right, that was it. William, any famous last words?
Okay, hold on 1 second. So while you're talking, I actually just added one more slide. I figured we have like another couple minutes. Do you mind clicking to the next screen?
Next screen?
It should reload. I think it should reload. Can you try it?
It's a white screen, a blank.
No, keep going. One more. Since I lost the audio, I want to kind of give something back. I know we've been talking a lot about these as previews capabilities and all that. And I figured, like, we've been spending some time on this. Why not make this available to our customer base and all that? So while you were talking, I kind of did some updates and all that. So could you change to the next screen one more time, please?
Whoa!
So everything that we've just talked about today, the new Vsphere UI integration, the Knative embedded integration, some of the sockeye functionality, much more. This is all part of our new upcoming v0.6 release. And when I say upcoming, I mean actually it's GA right now. And so I actually just published it. And so everything that we showed you today, which is really just a small sample of what you can do using event-driven automation and with the vSphere-based events. And so today you can actually go and access it today on flings.vmware.com. Love to hopefully connect with you guys with more afterwards. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to interact with us with some of our other resources.
Amazing. That's, oh, wow. You keep topping it, man. And we still have a little bit more time for questions. So let me actually see the chat if there's something else. Kripa, do we have open questions? Nope, we're good. Wow, cool. Awesome. Well, let me share you, because we have 2 minutes left, I want to share the resources where you can find out more. So since we have some time, all right, let's go there. There we go. So obviously the VBA team, we have a public Slack channel where you can reach out for help and questions. We also have a website. And if you are interested, like literally going hands down on Knative, go to the Knative website, which is actually currently being redesigned to make it a little bit more user-friendly, but it will give you all the details. And now that you have a little bit more understanding of eventing and serving and these building blocks, you will probably be finding yourself easy to navigate through the web page. Feel free to reach out to us, and a big shout out to the VBA team, but also to the Knative core team and community, which have been very helpful and appreciative and supportive along the way to get this work done.
Yeah, as well as many of the contributors. I mean, I see a lot of familiar faces, customers who've contributed, functions and code examples. And so hopefully you guys will kick the tires. The entire VBA team is out on the Slack channel. So you can reach out to us at any point in time. If there are particular inquiries, you can also email us or reach over Twitter and all that. And so hopefully you guys check out the new release, and really appreciate your guys' time and patience today.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Take care. Bye-bye.